Okay, good afternoon to everybody, and welcome to this global assembly. My name is Vishwas Satka. I'm wearing two hats in this convening engagement. I'm an academic at Wits University, and I teach on the Global Labor University program. And through the Global Labor University program, which has thrown its weight behind this, we've been able to network in our comrades and allies in the trade union movement in South Africa, on the continent and beyond. I also wear the hat of the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, a grassroots NGO in the South African context for the past 21 years. And we've co-founded the South African Food Sovereignty Campaign, the Climate Justice Charter Movement. And again, in that context, we've been able to reach out to allies, both in the country and beyond, to be part of this platform this afternoon. I'm going to co-chair this assembly with Zanele Matabula, an official from COSATU, as well as Comrade Ruth Intlekotse, who's the Deputy President of the National Union of Metal Workers of South Africa. I'll just make one or two more context-setting comments. We have rallied this assembly under the sort of broad slogans, Stand with Africa, Safe and Effective Vaccines for All, Healthcare and Frontline Workers of the World Unite. Now, the context in which we are convening is very, very important. It's 1 year of the pandemic in most parts of the world. We've had over 11.9 million cases of infection on the planet. We've had 2.6 million deaths. In the context of Africa, it's having its second wave. And as it stands of March 8th, we've had 4 million cases on the continent and almost 106,000 deaths. And the situation in Africa is poised to get worse. We have a few hotspots like South Africa, Egypt, and Morocco. But again, the world cannot move forward without ensuring safe and effective vaccines for all, including Africa. We now have vaccines in play in the context of this pandemic, but again, the rich countries have hoarded and bought out all of the vaccines. And so we have a supply crisis on the planet right now. We also have the COVAX facility and bilateral attempts by African governments to secure vaccines for their populations. But again, many have reached the conclusion that Africa will not have its vaccines this year. Actually, a minority of the population on the continent will have vaccines. The WTO refuses to provide a waiver to its TRIPS agreement to ensure that surplus production capacity in the global south can be utilized to produce more vaccines. So in that context, we have three basic objectives for this convening. The first is to push back against big pharma, the rich governments in the global north, as well as anti-vaxxers. I mean, at the highest echelons of the Tanzanian government, there's an anti-vaxxer position also on the continent, but also against lumpen elites who will want to indebt African governments and countries in the context of trying to procure vaccines, but also have corruption running rampant in the midst of all of that. The second objective for us is to build convergences. There's amazing work that's being done through People's Vaccine Campaign and various other initiatives, but we felt that it was important to strengthen that, to bring together global labor forces as well as global civil society, and to strengthen this common effort for a people's vaccine for everyone on planet Earth. And the third objective is to be catalytic in this conversation. There is an important need for us to cement our solidarities in national spaces, in continental spaces, and globally. There are several meetings of the WTO this year that we can still rally around. There's the UN convening in September, and there might be other initiatives in national spaces that you want to bring to the fore on this platform. So today we are hoping that we can get some kind of springboard action going to strengthen a global engagement around the need for safe and effective people's vaccines for all. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Comrade Zanele, and she's going to convene like the first panel, and she'll introduce it and the speakers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Vishwas, and good afternoon to everyone. I know others, it might be evening and others might still be morning. So welcome everyone. The panel is panel 1, and it is led by the trade unionists operating in South Africa, the continent, and the global arena. They will speak to the vaccine challenges, the struggles of healthcare and frontline workers, the importance of public health and internationalism. We have 9 panelists with us today. Comrade Baba Aye, who is a Health and Social Services Officer for Public Service International, PSI. And we have Zwelinzi Mavavi, the General Secretary of SAFTU. We've got Sylvia Habekost from Berlin. She's a nurse and a union activist for Verdi. We've got Keith Jacobs, who's the Regional Secretary of UNIC Global in Africa. We have Comrade Mike Shingange, the first Deputy President of COSATU. And we have Safianu Dauda Mohamed, who is the Regional Secretary of ITF Africa. We have Wiseman Dinwa, Head of Education of NACTU. We have Elijah Shiwata, Communications and Research Officer of Industrial Global Union. And last but not least, Comrade Godfrey Masale, Silame, my apologies. Silametsila, President of FEDUSA. Sorry, Comrade Godfrey. So those are the 9 panelists that we have. And to start us off will be Comrade Baba Aye. But before you start, please note that we have given 3 minutes to each speaker. And each will have, I will send you a message on the chat box. Please check your chat box. Once 2 minutes is over, I will send a message just to alert you that your time is about up. And once I send that message, please wrap up or check the screen. I will also alert you via the screen that your time is up. So I will hand over to the first speaker, Comrade Baba.
Thank you, Zanelli. It was clear for several years that a catastrophic pandemic was in the offing. Years of public cuts in funding of health and staff wage freezes had left public systems ill-prepared. Despite the warnings, despite the increasing transmission of zoonotic diseases that had made it clear the world would not be as lucky as with SARS at the beginning of the century, governments did not take action. But while there had been cuts in public health funding, global private sector interest had expanded. Health had become probably the fastest growing sector of the economy, drawing in some 8.9 trillion US dollars by 2019, up from 5.4 trillion just 5 years earlier. It had been growing at 7.3%. Health was seen as big business and not the public good that it should be. And that is the reason why you didn't have personal protective equipment for staff. There were shortages of beds, particularly in developing countries, but across the world. There was initial razzmatazz when the pandemic started that made there be hope that the governments and the corporations would listen to the voice of reason. But it became clear early on that this would not be the case. Intellectual property rights that are now coming to the fore with questions around the vaccine first played themselves up when health workers in Italy during the surge, produced personal protective equipment with 3D, and they were threatened with being taken to courts for breach of property rights. So now with the vaccine, you see public investment contributing significantly to the rapid development of these. Not less than 111 billion US dollars were contributed by governments, as well as know-how. But for the corporations, it's all about the profit that will be made. Pfizer and BioNTech alone stand to make over $13 billion from their vaccine. Now, the thing is that we have a vaccine imperialism, not because of lack of know-how, but because profit is considered first. And this is exactly what working class people have to resist. Working class internationalism is central to challenging this. But in our struggle for a people's vaccine, that is a vaccine that is available to everybody everywhere at no cost, we should see it as part of a broader fight for universal public health, because the reasons, it shouldn't be an episodic battle. The WHO Director General pointed out at the beginning of this pandemic that we are likely to still be even less prepared for the coming pandemic. And this means that the norms we set now will be pivotal to determine how governments respond, not only to this particular pandemic, but to the issue of our health and pandemics later. Crisis preparedness is not something distinct and separate from public health systems. They can only arise where you have well-funded, adequately staffed and strengthened public health systems. For us in Africa, there are, I mean, globally, governments make verbal commitments, sustainable development goals and all that, but their work is often different from their talk. 20 years ago in Africa, government committed in the Abuja Declaration to spending 15% of budgetary provision for health. Less than 10% of countries have at any time, implemented this. These are some of the issues we should fight for at this point in time in showing the interconnectedness, of the struggle for a people's vaccine, the struggle for public, and the needs for a new global order. Often the neoliberal project is, put as something different from the post-World War II order, which saw the welfare state with the NHS in Britain and the developmental state in Africa. But this did not in the global south. But this did not just happen. These were compromises by the bosses as a result of stiff fighting for system change by workers across the world. We have to take the battle back to them. It is not a defensive struggle. We must turn this into a counter-offensive to win a better world. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Papa. I will now hand over to the GS of SAF2, Comrade Zwelinzima Vavi.
Well, Zanel, I thought that we were going to follow the alphabetical order in terms of the names. In that case, I would have been the last person to speak. Good afternoon again, comrades, and thank you very much. Many, many years ago, we were warned by a gentleman called Karl Marx that the capitalist system is going to eat the two pillars that it stands on, the working class and the environment. We are in the middle of that metabolic shift that Karl Marx spoke about. We are reaching the end of the earth as we have known it, because the capitalist system as a system is eating the Mother Earth, and we're now sitting as witnesses to the marauding diseases, vaccines, you name them all, from the African continent to the rest of the world, and from the rest of the world to the African continent. Vishwas have already spoken about a staggering 116 million people that have already been infected by the coronavirus. He spoke about a 2.6 million people that have already died. And he spoke about this week, the World Trade Organization's refusing to waive so that the trips, so that the countries in the South, the countries in the developing world can have access and can produce their own vaccines in order to fight a pandemic that, if left alone, will wipe the entire humanity. We are in the middle of that crisis that so many of us have spoken about, an environmental catastrophe and the catastrophe of all of these diseases that are visiting us. So we are sitting here as the working class today debating how we're going to be responding to this unfolding calamity. The first point that we must say is that, of course, the battles of the world start at the local level. There can never be a defeat of the system in a struggle that is based on just networking through Zoom facility, the trade unions and progressive forces of the world, and think that through that you can win, or even to begin to tilt the balance of forces in favor of the working class anywhere in the world. We are trade unions from South Africa. We have been facing our own pandemics in our country. We inherited these pandemics from the colonial capitalist and the apartheid era. These pandemics have worsened in the first 27 years of our democratic, or so-called democratic, breakthrough of 1994. We're sitting with the worst unemployment rate in the entire world. We've become the most unequal society in the entire world. We're sitting with levels of poverty unseen in the history of this country, with 70% of the population today living on a mere upper poverty levels of 1,260 rands. We are facing a pandemic. In the midst of that pandemic, we have a government that was elected mainly by the poor and the working class, who honestly believe that this regime will have their best interest in heart. But unfortunately, when the many other crises of capitalism hit our shore, as the 2008-2009 world economic crisis, this government of the ANC chose to respond by cutting expenditure and embark on a massive austerity program. It is that austerity program that workers are revolting against in South Africa. SAFTU was in the streets on the 24th of February, the day that the Minister of Finance, with the members of Parliament,
Yes. Sorry.
My time is up.
Yes, please wrap up.
Oh, Zane.
You have only 3 minutes.
Okay.
You've already gone up to almost 4, 5.
That program is cutting even the healthcare budget, is cutting even the education budget, even the CCMA, even the police. Everybody is not left alone. And the result of that is that the nurses, the doctors do not have adequate PPEs, and they are dying in South Africa, left, right, and center. And that's what calls for unity, not through some rhetoric. Unity in action amongst workers here in South Africa and between workers of the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jess Vavi. And I will move on to Comrade Sylvia Hebekost from Berlin. The floor is yours.
Yes, hello. You did say my name right. I'm Sylvia Habekost, and I work as a nurse in Berlin, in a Berlin city hospital. And I've been doing so for more than 30 years. I'm also a union activist in my union, Verdi, the German Service Civil Union. The image that many people have of Germany from the outside is one that we have a great health system for all and an effective way to deal with a global health crisis like the COVID pandemic. But at a closer look, this is not the case. The pandemic put the focus on problems we've had before. There might be enough hospital beds, but not the necessary staff to care for the patients in all the beds. Long-term care is dramatically understaffed and underpaid. Personal protective gear was not available in sufficient quantities because of just-in-time storage and production, and global delivery chains broke down. Workers who keep the system going, nurses, physios, cleaners, assistants, are on the lowest pay scale and often female. The gap between the rich and poor increased. Working and housing conditions in industries like the meat industry, in agriculture or delivery centers led to outbreaks and high infection rates. Our fight against the focus on profit and not the patients in the health system started long before the pandemic. Nursing staff levels are some of the lowest in Europe. The working conditions have led to an exodus of nurses and to a dramatic shortage. In the first wave of the pandemic a year ago, the shutdown was radical enough to keep the infection rate comparatively low. In the summer, the capacities of intensive care units were increased, but the numbers of nurses were not. Also, schools did not prepare for the restart of school year after the summer break. In autumn, the second wave hit, and Christmas shopping was more important than the prevention of the virus. The second wave led to dramatic situations in the hospitals and a much higher number of deaths, which could have been prevented. Over the past year, my colleagues and I were constantly organizing for a change in healthcare financing, for better pay, and for mandatory staffing levels. In Berlin, my colleagues and I are at the start of a campaign to reach a union contract for staffing levels and union wages for all hospital workers. I want to make clear that Germany is not the global health champion. Nationalism comes first. The best example are the vaccines. There is no national solution, not in this globalized world. SARS-CoV-2 is the virus. Neoliberal globalization is the pandemic. The world needs decolonizing. As a start, vaccines have to be made global public goods. It's not a question of charity, it's a matter of global justice. What we demand is global health justice and the socialization and collectivization of the healthcare sector and the pharmaceutical industry. The privatization of profits and socializing of the losses have to stop. Health and access to healthcare is a human right and not a commodity. What we need is a real change in politics. We need local and global revolutions. My colleagues and I, we fight locally, but think globally. We have a slogan in our fight. Mehr von uns ist besser für alle. More of us is better for all. And that slogan also works for this assembly. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Our next speaker, I'm going to hand over to Comrade Keith Jacobs of UNI.
You need to unmute.
Thanks, Comrade Zanele, and good day, comrades. The World Health Organization's Africa Immunization Coordinator said in January that the objective is to vaccinate 20% of the African population by the end of 2021. Now, this is in stark contrast in what is currently happening in the developed world, where rich countries are bulk buying vaccines, like Comrade V said, to ensure that they reach herd immunity sooner to get their economies going. Now, we, comrades in UNI Global Union, believes that vaccine access should be universal and free of charge, and we actively support the global efforts for equitable and widespread vaccine distribution. The essential right to a safe workplace must include the right to vaccination, regardless of whether you live in New York, London, or in Blantyre. To this end, UNI Global Union will continue to campaign that the World Trade Organization give a TRIPS waiver for developed countries to also produce the life-saving vaccines. Now, during the scramble for Africa between the late 18th and 19th century, those who came to colonize and plunder the resources of the continent brought with them new technology that they kept for themselves to conquer and steal. This cannot continue in the 21st century, where these very same countries who build their economies and technological power with the proceeds of their plunder will keep life-saving vaccines to themselves and for their own economic recovery. We are saying that big pharmaceutical companies and multinational corporations cannot be the ones that are now making massive profits and are through the back door putting pressure on the WTO themselves to not provide the TRIPS waiver so that they can continue to stock their coffers at the expense of those in the developing world, and in particular those here in Africa. We are calling upon those in power to now ensure that all have equitable access to vaccines. And for those countries, especially here in South Africa, we have and many other countries in the African continent do have the capacity to also manufacture vaccines that can save the lives of their citizens and allow them also to build back their economies that was also ravaged by the lockdowns as a result of this virus. Thank you very much for listening and for the opportunity.
Wow, you did below 3 minutes. Well done. I will now hand over to the first Deputy President of COSATU, Comrade Mike Shingange. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Comrade Zanel. I want to build the record of below the 2 minutes. I have greeted everyone. From COSATU, first I want to recognize the World Health Organization for declaring 2021 as the year to invest, or as the year of healthcare workers, and also to make sure that we protect the working environment in the public health or in the workplaces of the workers. We think that more than ever before, the world has come to recognize and appreciate the significance and the importance of and the role of these healthcare workers, because more and more of them, they continue to put their life at risk in order to serve the rest of the population of the world. And we think that, as you know, in South Africa, that about 40,000 of them now, they've already been contracted this virus, and about 2% of that 40,000 have actually already lost their lives. It's a good recognition because it is only through this public health system, and in fact, the feel protected and safe and incentivized public health care workers, that the world can be saved from this pandemic. If there's one thing that the pandemic has actually exposed, is the need to strengthen the public healthcare system rather than to rely on, for instance, in South African context, a two-tier healthcare system that sometimes the healthcare provision is supposed to be given according to the economic status of South Africans or anywhere else in the world. If it was not for the about 28,000 community healthcare workers who go around the country and do door-to-door in communities and screen people and test, and including the medical practitioners that we have in our hospitals and the nurses in the world, we think that more South Africans will have perished from this pandemic. We think by declaring this 2021 as the year of public health care workers, it is actually an investment in the people who invest their life in our own lives as South Africans. We think, therefore, we need to unite globally as a trade union movement to fight the profit-driven and profit-oriented companies that want to maximize profit at a time when more and more vulnerable people need to be assisted and need to make sure that they stay alive. That's what we need to unite and push back, so that the sick people should not be looked at as the market from which profit must be made. One of the other things that we want to highlight, we think that we must also unite and push back the brutality of those who are powerful against the nations that are weak. We call today the international world to unite and condemn the apartheid Israel for stopping and blocking more than 1,000 vials of vaccines that were meant to go to the frontline workers in the Gaza Strip that is blocked by the apartheid Israel. That is an act of genocide, that's an act of massacre, killing frontline workers that are trying to save the people in the blocked area, and then you stop them because you think that they're going to be used to kill the Israelis. We think we need to unite. The last thing we want to raise, Chair, is that there's a lot of vaccine negativity. People are very negative. There are those who are campaigning that workers and population must not be vaccinated. Our view is that scientifically, historically, vaccine has all been the only scientifically proven method that has made people to be immune from any viruses in the past. We therefore call on workers, particularly frontline workers, to be brave, to stand on front, to volunteer, to be vaccinated, so that their life first must be safe, so that they can save the lives of the rest of us. By investing in the people who invest in us, one of the things that is needed is to incentivize those, is to employ more public health workers, so that indeed, thank you very much.
Thank you, President. You went over 3 minutes. Can I hand over now to Safianu Dauda Mohammed of ITF Africa? The floor is yours, sir.
Okay, thank you very much, Zanele, and thank you, comrades. I'm actually representing ITF, which is International Transport Workers Federation, that is responsible for Solidarity Action Campaign and, of course, of transport workers' rights, justice, and equalities. I have my talking points will actually be focused on why equitable access to vaccine in the global south is not only the right thing to do, but the interest of all countries. We also have the need to take steps to expand vaccine production and equitable distribution. There is also a very serious need to consider related issues such as management of data so as to maintain public trust. We are seeing now vaccine nationalism. The US, UK, and EU have pre-purchased enough vaccines to their populations more than twice over. At the same time, the UN has warned that 130 countries have not received a single dose. This is not only wrong, but self-defeating. We live in an interconnected and interdependent world, and the failure to fulfill those in the global south will bounce on us all. Transport provides an example of this. Global transport chain, supply chain depends on transport workers from all over the world. A single vessel transporting goods can have, for example, Russians, South Africans, Nigerians, Germans, Kenyans, workers on it together. Without equitable access, we cannot make the global supply chains we all depend on for our food and of course for our survival. Failure to vaccine parts of the world creates risks of variants, which again can be transmitted back to wealthier countries. And this can all impact on both health and of course the global economy. More broadly, we need to be ramping up production of approved vaccines. As you all know, the COVAX facility has set a target of vaccinating 20% of the world, of the people in the world, of the people of the people in the process, the world in the process, the poorest world countries. Let me put it that way. By the end of this year, on current trends, however, even this low target will not be realized. We need to look at expanding production so that there are more vaccines available, including by tackling intellectual property, which blocks some manufacturers in the volume for producing the volume that we actually needed. Crucially, we need an approach which vaccinate workers who are at the higher risk or whose work creates higher risk of transmission to others, such as transport workers, education workers, and healthcare workers. It is important to look at other aspects of vaccination processes which if managed badly, could undermine public trust. For example, this is the management of personal data around vaccine passport. There are questions over who owns and controls this data and what accountability there is, which need to be recognized and addressed accordingly. Thank you for listening and thank you for this opportunity. Zanele, you are muted. Can you unmute?
Oh,
Unmute.
sorry. All right. So I just wanted to say, just to the participants, feel free to fill in your questions on the chat line. As we continue, you will get a chance towards the end to participate through your questions. And I'm going to hand over now to Wiseman Dinwa, representing NACTU. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Comrade Zanele, and a very good afternoon to all the comrades there. First, we want to honor with respect all the frontline workers, in particular healthcare workers, for standing up and engaged in a brave fight against this invisible, brutal, and unknown pandemic. We salute these heroes and heroines who sometimes had to surrender their lives in trying to save the world population from this pandemic. Now that the vaccine is available, as NACTU, we wish to express our grave concern and disappointment on the vaccine rollout in its current form, which can be simulated to the apartheid-like style of treating the population. As NACTU, we are calling on all nations of the world to ensure equitable and fair distribution of vaccine, and also to condemn and fight the monopoly of big pharmaceutical companies in the production and supply of vaccines, and to fight vaccine imperialism by rich governments who always exacerbate their capitalist agenda through vaccine discrimination, while the poor and the working class are left to die from the pandemic. As NACTU, we are calling on all global unions and civil society to work together to ensure that the working class and the poor have equal access to the vaccine, just like the big capital and the monopolist as well. So we hope that will ensure safe and effective vaccine for all. I thank you, comrade.
Thank you very much, Wiseman. I'm gonna hand over now to the next speaker, Comrade Elijah Chibota, from Industrial. Comrade Elijah, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Comrade Zanele, and greetings to all the comrades who are attending this, this webinar. Most of the points have been raised by the previous speakers, which means there's a convergence in terms of our demands on our expectations on vaccine equity, and also vaccine supply constraints, the hoarding by the global north. Like America is about 1.4% of the world population, but so far they've accessed around 30% of the vaccines. And then at the same time, you've got the COVAX facility, which is meant to benefit developing countries, which is accessed far much less than the vaccines that they need. So, which means this is the global inequality, which manifests itself in so many areas of economic life, and trade unions and global trade unions have been campaigning for equality for a long time. So we can as well talk of the vaccine imperialism and so on. So instead of repeating what has been mentioned by the previous speakers, I just want to mention the point on health and safety. To say that the ILO must recognize COVID-19 as an occupational disease. This is the approach that Industrial Global Union has been taking, to say if we recognize COVID-19 is an occupational disease, and also for health and safety to be included as part of the fundamental rights under the ILO, we will then have a platform or a way of dealing with COVID-19. So this will help workers to explore different avenues in collective bargaining agreements in the countries and in their national labor standards and so on, so that they're able to deal with COVID-19. We've also had, I think in a lot of countries, there's the issue of essential service workers. So a lot of countries in Africa, they've defined certain categories of workers as essential service workers for the purpose of denying those workers their rights. So we can actually use the same definitions to say essential service workers should be the first on the vaccination line. These include the healthcare workers and so on. Thank you, Comrade Zanele.
Thank you, Comrade Elijah. And then I'm going to hand over to our last speaker in this panel, Comrade Godfrey Limatsila. I apologize for mispronouncing your name earlier. So I'm just going to hand over to you, President Godfrey.
Comrade Zanele, friends present in this webinar, FEDUSA is very much delighted to be invited to this vital webinar and be part of the solution to existential challenges that have been imposed on us by the global COVID-19 pandemic. As the world begins to roll out emergency approved vaccines, one of the biggest challenges we face as the African continent is marshalling the enormous resources needed to procure vaccines on a massive scale for millions and millions who need it most. For us to begin approaching numbers necessary for national and continental herd immunities, vaccine saves lives. There we shall allow the anti-vaccine lobbies to prevent it. As South Africa, we are part of the COVAX efforts, but we would like to appeal to wealthy nations from the industrial world to same and to allow them to give the countries in Africa more of these vaccines in an effort to help vulnerable African nations and to save life. It is our view that globally all governments must work together to ensure that citizens of all countries are immunized before the end of 2021 to achieve herd immunity and save lives. Our understanding is that vaccines are one of the safest and most effective tools available to control and prevent COVID-19 infections. Those of us working in the health facilities are aware that immunizations were introduced some decades ago in preventing infectious diseases and saving lives. Chairperson, yes, the procurement of large deliveries of safe and effective vaccines is a big problem that we are facing as Africa. But it is also one of the many serious challenges we have to address as a continent when it comes to the massive rollout of the COVID-19 vaccine. I'm talking here, Chairperson and comrades, about a worrying tendency of vaccine hesitancy, where a growing number, including many healthcare workers, who are reluctant or unwilling to get vaccinated. The reason for the hesitancy seem to be many and varied and include legitimate fears of vaccines that have been highly fast-tracked compared to the numbers of years that would normally take a new vaccine to be approved and regulated. Yeah, but maybe it is lack of good public education, and as trade unions, we must take the effort in trying to make sure that we educate our members to the effect that they are ready and accept, to be immunized, more especially the frontline workers and all the essential services. Thank you, Chairperson.
Thank you very much, Comrade Godfrey. This is the last speaker of the first panel. And at this point, I'm going to hand over to Comrade Ruth Ndukuludze, the Deputy President of NUMSA, National Union of Metal Workers in South Africa. So can I just hand over to Comrade Ruth from NUMSA?
Thank you very much, Comrade Zanele. It's Ruth Ntlokotsi, the second Deputy President of NUMSA. Good afternoon, good evening, and good morning to everyone. Let me take this opportunity to welcome everyone to our second panel that will be dealing with the Uniting the World Against Big Pharma and Vaccine Injustice. In our panel, we will be joined with 11 panelists. The first panelist is Comrade Roshida Mula. She's the President of South African Informal Traders Alliance. The second panelist is Comrade Jeremy Corbyn, the British MP, the founder of Peace and Justice Project. The third panelist is Comrade Estafinda Kanda, the Director on Women and Extractives. The fourth speaker is Comrade Million Bilay, the General Coordinator of Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa. The fifth speaker is Comrade Awande Buthelezi, the researcher and the co-organizer of Cooperatives and Policy Alternative Center. The sixth speaker is Comrade Hamida Didat, the interim organizer of People and Vaccine Campaign of the Republic of South Africa. The seventh speaker is Comrade Janice Pedersen, the Senior Humanitarianism Policy Advisor and Medicines from the Frontiers. The eighth speaker is Comrade Ferial Adam, the organizer of Climate Justice Charter Movement of the Republic of South Africa. We also joined by Comrade Jan Leydeyska, who's the director of the Rosa Luxemburg Stiftaf of Republic of South Africa. The 11th speaker is Comrade Alson Dasu, the convener of the Progressive Health. Our last speaker, it will be Comrade Carlos Marenles, who is the director of the Border Agricultural Workers Project Coordinator, La Via Companisa from the North America region. Comrades, we all have 3 minutes to speak. I think I'm also going to do the same from what Comrade Zanele did. I will indicate if you are exceeding the time that is allocated to you. I'm going to hand over to our first panelist, Comrade Rashida. The platform is yours.
Hi, thank you, Chair. I thank you for inviting me onto this platform and duly acknowledge the presence of such a distinguished representation. Greetings and salutations to you all. To put it bluntly, ladies and gentlemen, we are very concerned about the welfare of our sector insofar as an equitable distribution of COVID-19 vaccines is concerned. It would seem that equitable distribution is a term that applies and occurs only within and among the rich Western nations. Indeed, we welcome the vaccine rollout in our country, and we understand who needs to be prioritized. However, I do worry about the informal workers and their families, as
We can't hear Comrade Rashida.
Sorry, I don't know. I had a glitch in my in my Zoom here. I'm so sorry about that. As I was saying, currently we do not know the status of vaccine distribution, given the uncertainty around the efficacy of the first 1 million doses of the AstraZeneca South Africa bought, albeit in good faith. This only slows down the rollout process and further disadvantages low-income workers. For as long as this is delayed, our workers who go out and brave the elements each day are at greater risk of infection. We are, after all, frontline workers servicing the daily passing trade. The South African Informal Traders Alliance extends a plea to all represented on this platform to act in unison in a greater cause, that the preservation of life. We stand ready to work with you in ensuring a safe, proven, and timeous distribution of vaccine to the masses of marginalized informal workers all over the world. I am Rashida Muller, the president of SAITA. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Rashida. We sincerely apologize about the technical glitches. Comrades, we'll move over to our third speaker. We are still allocating Comrade Jeremy Corbyn. Comrade Esther Kanda, the platform is yours, my leader. Comrade Esther. Unmute yourself, leader. You are still muted. Comrade Esther.
Okay, sorry about that. Good afternoon. Hello?
We can hear you, my leader.
Okay.
Yes.
Yeah, the topic is very important and is very timely. Advocating for our frontline workers, for effective and healthy vaccination. This crucial movement is a very important call, and we want to join the African colleagues all over Africa to advocate for our frontline workers. Drawing back experience from Ebola that affected and saw the demise of a lot of frontline workers and health workers in Sierra Leone in 2014, 2015, the sub-region, Sierra Leone, Guinea, and Liberia. We saw a lot of frontline workers lost their life, their family lost their life, just so that because they are willing and we are fighting for their rights and the lives of other people. Now we are in this pandemic, COVID-19. We are in the whole world standstill because of COVID-19. This is very serious. This is not a time to marginalize countries like developing countries like my country, Sierra Leone, a very small country and underdeveloped. This is the time for all Africans to actually take the bull by its own. When I say Africa, I also mean our leaders to actually join forces together so that we and the frontline workers can get the kind of attention they need. They are families, they are also part of the society. If they are not protected, it can easily go back to the community and also affect the community. But also there's something very important as a civil society activist, because we go to the community, we hear people talk, there's a lot of myths, there's a lot of misinformation about this vaccine that is out, which I think is one of the areas we should step up by debunking some of this information that is going around, that the vaccine is not good, it's actually prepared so that they can kill Africans. So these are things we need to actually come up as Africans so that we speak with one voice. And I think the CDA, the World Health Organization, and the pharmaceutical industry have a great role to play in that. If those information are going back, even the frontline workers will be afraid to even take the vaccination. So if we are going to succeed in this campaign, I think one of the things we need to do, how do we ensure that the vaccine that is coming that is effective and is something that our frontline workers can accept, because there are some that are still skeptical about it. So as a civil society activist, we think there's a lot more to do, in as much as we want our frontline workers to be safe, but there's a lot more to do in terms of information dissemination. If we say we are just going to campaign for the vaccination and forgetting that aspect of it.
Can you wrap up, my leader?
Come again?
I was saying that, can you wrap up?
Yeah, so that's my message. More information, more sensitization on the effectiveness and the safety of the vaccine is also needed.
Thank you very much, Comrade Esther. Our next speaker is Comrade Million Pillay. Over to you, Comrade Million.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me, Vishwas. My hats off for extraordinary work that you're doing. I am the General Coordinator of the Alliance for Food Sovereignty in Africa, the biggest social movement in Africa. We work in all of the African countries now. It's broad-based. I just want to use this opportunity also to thank the thousands of African civil society organizations who did really fill the gap that was created in servicing our local communities during the lockdowns, and who really organized food and other services to our local communities. I think they filled that gap, and governments in their future strategies should recognize that. I just wanted to also broaden this issue, out of the vaccine issue, which is very much important, I know. But what is the source of COVID? Basically, there are two sources of pandemics, including COVID. One is expansion to new natural areas by industrial agricultural system, and also intensive livestock production. These are the two source of pandemics and future pandemics, and including COVID. If we really want to understand understand the sources and address future pandemics, including COVID, we need to address that. So we have to have two strategies. One is a short-term strategy, and the other is a long-term strategy. As AFSA, as a short-term strategy, we actually support the proposal from South Africa and India to the TRIPS Council for the waiver from the implementation, application, and enforcement of the intellectual property rights of products and their underlying technologies for prevention, containment, or treatment of COVID until widespread vaccination is in place globally, and until the majority of the world population has developed an immunity. So in terms of a strategy, we actually support that. But counter to the industrial agriculture as a long-term strategy, we promote food sovereignty. Food sovereignty is very, very much critical, because we could see now, in vaccine nationalism, in vaccine hoarding, that Africa has to rely on itself. We cannot rely on other continents for our food, for our vaccine, and for other issues. So food sovereignty is very much important, and at the center of food sovereignty, the tenets of food sovereignty is local ownership of our food system and self-sufficiency. I think that's very much important. And as part of the broader agroecology agenda, food sovereignty agenda, we need to endorse also agroecology. And in this way, we can produce more food, we can produce nutritious and healthy food, without impacting the environment and in the rights-based approach. I think that's very much critical. Our small research have found that there are lots and lots of
Can you wrap up, comrade?
yes, seeds and vegetables with African farmers, which are much more nutritious and which are very, very critical to our to the protecting of African societies from COVID and future pandemics. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Million. Can we invite our next speaker, Comrade Awande Buthelezi? Comrade Awande.
Thank you, Chair. I have the pleasure of speaking from the perspective of the Cooperative and Policy Alternative Center, COPAC. And I'd like to begin first by saying that this week we saw xenophobic attacks take place in Durban against traders in the city. And in speaking about uniting the world against big pharma and vaccine injustice, we have to speak also from a South African perspective, especially with regards to the rights of migrants and refugees to be ensured. Their rights should be ensured during the rollout of the vaccine plan. We need to stand in solidarity with these communities and with all who live in our land. As we are fighting for international unity and solidarity, we must also extend the same spirit of solidarity locally and regionally to all our brothers and sisters. And our work at COPAC, it spans systemic alternatives, particularly through our work on food sovereignty and climate justice. And our work on food sovereignty with small-scale farmers, local community food producers is an example of how lines of solidarity can be built through the creation of an alternative food system. These are the kind of things in the kind of uniting and solidarity that this kind of event is putting forward that we need to think about, and examples of the ways in which we can come together, particularly in times of crisis. Our work on climate justice also stands in solidarity with and connects to other 1.5 degrees Celsius movements around the planet. And the theme that comes out of this work, more relevant than ever during this time, is the concept and the reality of commoning. Commoning is sustaining life right now for a lot of people throughout the global south, in our country also. And particularly in the context of climate crisis and the pandemic, this concept and this issue and reality of commoning is something which will become more important. Commoning is a practice of collaborating and sharing to meet everyday needs and to achieve well-being of individuals, communities, and lived environments. And it is in the spirit of commoning that I must say that we need to call and fight for a decommodified vaccine. We need to ensure against future pandemics through the strengthening of our public healthcare systems. Thank you, Chair, and I'd like to cede my time.
Thank you very much, Comrade Awande. I think you did well in terms of time. It was 2 minutes. Can we invite our next speaker, Comrade Hamida? The platform is yours, my leader.
Thank you very much, Comrade Ruth, and good afternoon to everybody. I'm representing the PVC, which is the People's Vaccine Campaign of South Africa, but I'm also the Executive Director of Naledi. So just in terms of who the PVC is and what we're demanding, we demand safe and affordable and effective vaccines for all in South Africa, as well as the Global South. We are a network representing labor, civil society organizations, CSOs, NGOs, health professionals across the various fraternities, as well as academics and individuals who are all concerned and fighting for the access to affordable vaccines, as well as safe vaccines. We serve as a vehicle to speak out against vaccine apartheid. And we also are currently trying to do a lot of advocacy and education work. We've developed a manual and we're hoping to engage communities at the grassroots level so that they can become the part of the campaign and become the societal watchdog to ensure that the interests of South Africans, particularly in the context of the vaccine, is served. I think we also strongly oppose to vaccine apartheid, and we demand, I think other comrades have raised it, we demand that there's a TRIPS waiver at the WTO, particularly in the context of a pandemic. We feel that the lack of equal or no access to vaccines in certain countries in the Global South, in the context of a pandemic is a moral catastrophe. And we believe that licensing on a collective basis with technology transfer, which is south to south, on a south to south basis, is essential for us to be able to address this pandemic. Finally, in terms of the vaccine and vaccine production, we believe that South Africa has the potential to do this. And if they do not, in terms of international pharmaceutical companies and institutions like the WTO and the World Health Organization, if they do not facilitate vaccine production, which is essential for us in terms of our own ability to have sovereign infrastructure, it is an indictment. For us to be able to produce vaccines for ourselves is actually more than a national security issue. It is actually a matter of life and death. And so we therefore demand, both in terms of the ending of the apartheid against vaccines and withholding of vaccines for people in the global south. And we definitely want to ensure that in terms of the rollout that the apartheid, and I think comrades have raised that as well, that the way in which the rollout of the vaccines are happening in South Africa really speaks to the issues on the ground, and that we put the most vulnerable first. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Comrade Habida. Our next panelist is Comrade Jens Peterson. Comrade Jens, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Ruth, and thanks for the organizers for having me on this distinguished panel. I think it's important that we must acknowledge that at the moment we are relying on a global access system to vaccines, which is based solemnly on procurement. In other words, it's based on the buying power of the nations or the corporations that are accessing vaccines at the moment. Now, an access system based on buying power and purely on procurement perpetuates inequality. What it does, as we see now, is that it prevents poorer nations, Africa in particular, to equitably access vaccines. We have to challenge that, and we have to challenge it from a political perspective. Now, as was said earlier by Mr. Pillay as well, we know from a long time that in order to secure and have any semblance of equity when it comes to, for example, vaccines as it is now, we must be self-sufficient. COVID-19 has taught us that whether it's the vaccines, whether it's the treatment, whether it's the PPE, in order to have an equitable access, we need to expand and increase African manufacturing. And the COVID-19 pandemic is just the latest example of that. Esther mentioned the Ebola outbreak in West Africa, which is another example where we as Africa relied on technology and vaccines from wealthy nations. Now, when we are raising some of the concerns in order to secure equity and to expand manufacturing, we are often challenged and faced, as we are at the World Trade Organization at the moment, with technical arguments. Technical arguments such as that existing mechanisms within the TRIPS system are sufficient, that rolling out manufacturing is not going to have an impact on the current pandemic. There is criticism of national regulatory authorities. However, these technical arguments are used to hide behind a lack of political will, because what we must accept and acknowledge and how we must approach this is from the perspective that it remains a political struggle. Vaccine equity and access to vaccines for African countries and communities is and will remain a political struggle. Only if we build the right political coalitions, if we demonstrate the international political solidarity as we have now, and if we support and pressure our political leadership, will we be able to address and overcome all of these technical arguments that are otherwise presented as barriers. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Jens. Our next speaker is Comrade Farrell. Comrade Farrell, the platform is yours. Unmute yourself.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Thank you.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you to the organizers for such an amazing assembly. I'm coming from the perspective of the Climate Justice Charter and the link to health. So one of the things that, just for people who don't know, the Climate Justice Charter was drawn up in South Africa over the last, it's taken a number of years of work, but we've delivered it to the South African Parliament last year. And we deal with we've consulted with a range of people, from workers to youth to media, and kind of honed in on the demands, and one of which was health. And it specifically deals with emergency, holistic healing, and preventative health care. And if we look at what's been happening right now with COVID, we can see the inequality in healthcare, and everyone's been saying this on this discussions from the start, is that there's a big inequality in our healthcare systems. And what this means is that this will also manifest, if you think about the impacts of climate change, the harms that it will bring and the injustice that it will bring. And we're seeing that, living it right now. So we need to be aware, and that's the thing of how we can use the lessons from COVID. We need a public, accessible, responsive healthcare system, which we don't have. And you can see the private sector more and more pushing, and we saw that in South Africa, where the private sector, where certain political parties were pushing for private healthcare to have access and to kind of roll out the vaccine. So we need to stop that. We need to stop the privatization that's happening around our health, around our water, around our food. We need a preventative orientation. So the other thing about the Climate Justice Charter, even though we drew it up in South Africa, is that it's not just for South Africa, and it calls for a radical Pan-Africanism, and that is something that is important because we can use it across the continent. We know that with COVID-19 and the vaccines, that Africa is in the moral crisis of vaccine injustice, and rich countries are hoarding it, which is absolutely sick. It's just appalling that they can do that. It's a violation of basic human rights. Rich countries have failed to solve the global pandemic. In fact, they've gone into a hole, and they've only kind of closed off their borders. And if we think about the kind of pandemics we're going to have with climate change and how much worse things are going to get, we can see that the world is not ready for the climate crisis. So there is a need for a renewed internationalism. We have to relook at it. We have to look at an internationalism that is grounded in practical resistance and struggle. We have to push back Big Pharma, and we have to push back privatization of our health and water and food. More pandemics, more variants are going to arise. It's going to happen. And without an effective healthcare system, we are only going to increase the divide between those that have and those that do not have. So I think that the Climate Justice Charter, it brings in all the different sectors, and it makes those linkages, which is very important, and I think should be spread across the continent. But I do think we need to use this, what has happened with COVID, as a reality of what can happen and how much worse it can be. So we need to stop Big Pharma from behaving the way that it's doing, but also we need to stop rich countries for doing what they're doing. I mean, one of the speakers mentioned Israel. That is just atrocious. There is no words to describe how disgusting that is. And we have to, as civil society, we have to start standing up.
Can you wrap up, Comrade?
Behavior. I'm done. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Farrell. Our next speaker is Comrade Jan. Comrade Jan?
Yes, I'm here. Hello, Ruth.
Hi.
Nice to meet all of you. Just a quick correction. I'm still named as the director of the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation Southern African office. That is technically not correct, and it has something to do with this panel. I'm now the new head of our Geneva office, which is a new office that we created just to deal with some aspects as, from a democratic socialist perspective of what we have discussed now, because it's supposed to be dealing with three intersecting topics, which is international labor, global social rights, and global health. And I mean, a lot of things have been said already here that I don't want to repeat in terms of vaccination access. It's just very obvious that denying universal access to vaccination is a self-defeating policy because it will increase the risk of mutation and variations, deeming the whole process of vaccination irrelevant, unless you want to have a massive global and even more intense mobility restriction regime and border regimes, which is simply not tenable. So it's self-defeating, and it's obvious that universal access has to be generated. Second, but this is more than a legal right, or like opening up, for example, the right to. Apparently the vaccines that are available are very sometimes difficult to produce. It's not just, as Jens Pedersen said, a question of procurement. Main problem is also distribution. I will come to this in my last point. There are multiple actors that are also problematic, and I know many of you have already here said something about the situation in Israel. I would like us, actually, since we are here all in Africa, to be as loud about, I think, the scandalous behavior of many African governments. Most importantly, I think, the government of Tanzania and its ridiculous president, who are COVID deniers and who are condemning their population to death. And it's completely unacceptable, and the complete silence of the African Union and African leadership on these regimes is absolutely abhorrent, and I think it's a very big problem. So lastly, let me just say, I think for us as an organization, the necessity of transnational organizing on this question is obvious, because we need a global system of solidarity and global direct financing and global direct financing of public health in Africa and other countries. But because if this pandemic has shown one thing, it's that there is an access, there needs to be that one thing is possible. If we use a global vaccination program and to come to an end as an entry point to finance infrastructure like we did, for example, with the HIV/AIDS campaigns all across the African continent, beyond the question of vaccination, these infrastructure could actually serve to distribute all other, I think, publicly available vaccinations, other healthcare providers, because it makes, for me, the question of universal access to all available therapies is a starting point for a global public healthcare system that should be equally and globally financed, and healthcare should not be just left to the market forces. And with this, I want to leave it. Thank you, everybody.
Thank you very much, Comrade JJ. Comrades, thank you very much for the comments. I can see also comments are coming in from the chat box. Keep on throwing your comments towards the end of the program. Comrade Vish will deal with the comments. Our next speaker is Comrade Dasu. Over to you, Comrade Dasu. Comrade Esther, can you mute yourself, leader? Comrade Dasu?
Hi, hello everyone. Good afternoon to you all. Thank you for the organizers and others.
Hold on a second. Comrade Esther, can you mute yourself, leader? We can hear you from the background. Can you mute yourself? Thank you, my leader. Proceed, Comrade Dasu.
Yes. So my name is Aslam Dasu. I'm the convener of the Progressive Health Forum, which is a national advocacy network of health veterans, health activists, experts, and researchers concerned with the state of the public health system, and now with the pandemic. I think most of what I wanted to say has been touched on in some or other form by the other speakers. So let me just focus on two things. First is that the global public health emergency due to COVID-19 is a singular harbinger of the future of the world. Now, having already delivered the greatest shock to the global economy in recorded history, the response of governments has rightly focused on keeping their populations safe, while wrongly forecasting a return to normal economic activity in due course. And this is because of a failure to place the pandemic in a broader context of this Anthropocene period in which humanity has left its mark on the planet. The crisis of global heating, biodiversity collapse is coinciding with the crisis in global capital, together with the loss of capabilities in states to provide public goods, and the advent of COVID-level pandemics now into the future. So obstacles to a recovery brings up a great irony in that big pharma, which is rightly criticized for trade policy that reduces access to vaccines, and many speakers have spoken before me about this, especially for those in the developing world, is matched in this mendacity by governments worldwide. So expecting a TRIPS waiver to stimulate supply in the short or medium term is the triumph of hope over experience. But this still remains a necessary and vital struggle, not so much to obtain a waiver in terms of a protocol that requires the consent of those with no incentive to grant it, but more to entrench an entirely new regime to meet an increasingly precarious future of the worsening burden of disease. TRIPS can't be reformed. It must be removed and a new protocol put in place. But this is a struggle of decades, and we've been involved in the struggle as we developed South Africa's pharmaceutical regime for the post-apartheid democratic era, and which was mediated by Kofi Annan at the UN together with President Mbeki, which was the stimulus for the global agreement that we see now in TRIPS. Now, during the AIDS crisis here, pharma agreed to provide ARVs at affordable prices in terms of this agreement. But in a supreme irony, Mbeki then refused to purchase them because he didn't believe HIV caused AIDS. So the villains of the peace in poor access to vaccine in the global south are both pharma and governments. Now, for now, we need much more vaccine through widespread voluntary licensing of manufacture to protect the people, which is the overarching human rights concern at this point in the pandemic. And while the restrictive trade policies of big pharma are well known, people tend to ignore, be more accommodating of, or even become apologists for governments whose policies, even in the developing world, aid and abet these restrictions. Two failures come to mind. The first, and we've seen it here, is confining procurement of vaccine to national governments on the simplistic premise that it's a rational response to the global demand for vaccine. Now, quite apart from the ineptitude of the government to procure vaccine, which we've seen, big pharma saw them coming and tailored supply accordingly and created this dog-eat-dog procurement crisis. This was inevitable, and we warned them about this, but they didn't listen. What is also inevitable is that in due course, private procurement by elite purchasers will occur. It will have been better then to get ahead of this curve by permitting transparent
Can you wrap up, comrade?
and non-profit private, I'm about to finish, and for-profit private procurement at risk under an overarching nationally mandated rollout strategy coordinated by governments. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Tasu. Our next speaker is Comrade Carlos. Comrade Carlos, the platform is yours.
Thank you, Comrade Ruth. Buenos días and good afternoon to all of you. This day, I'm communicating from El Paso, Texas, on the United States-Mexico border. I'm in the American side, and from here, from my window, I can see the landscape of Mexico. In the region, like in many places across the world, the pandemic has affected everybody, everywhere. There's much suffering, deaths, but the communities more affected, the migrant farm workers, the migrant communities, the indigenous communities, the women, especially the single mothers, have been affected the most. And these are the most affected who has been excluded from most of the measures of protection to confront COVID-19. Today, we are not only facing disproportionate impact upon the most marginalized and poor communities and poor people of the world, but today we are also facing a COVID-19 vaccination apartheid. And this is the purpose of this assembly, to figure out how to end that apartheid. One of the most important aspects that we have to remember that we are in this so terrible pandemic crisis due to the many years of colonization and of neoliberal policies that basically destroy most of the public health systems in the cities. And not only that, colonization and neoliberal policies that destroyed the ability and the capacity of many communities, many villages to deal with the health crisis like the one that we face today. So what should we do? You know, right now what we have is a situation where, for example, Zimbabwe don't have a one simple secure vaccine for a person, while, for example, countries like Canada, they have so many vaccines that they can apply a vaccine 6 times to every person in Canada. So what should we do to end this disproportional exclusion that is affecting most of our communities, most of the communities of people of color? We need to do many things. One, we need to dismantle and end the white privilege. We cannot continue to accept that only white people receive the vaccine while people of color are left out of this so-called vaccine rollout. The other thing that we need to do is we need to resist the continuation of certain sectors of the economy that are very important for capital. We as working people have the capacity to disrupt a fully return of sectors of the economy that are essential for capital. We have to take our lives out of the hands of the World Trade Organization. The World Trade Organization represents the interests of capital, including the corporations that now have the control over the different types of vaccines, you know, being applied to a minority of our population. We have to pressure the states and the institutions to strengthen the role of the World Health Organization in to make sure the equal access to vaccinations. Today, I think this assembly called upon all of us to call and to demand that the vaccine be a public right, a free right, and an essential right for everybody all over the world, including and especially the people most affected by this terrible pandemic crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Comrade Carlos. Comrades, before I can pass the baton back to Comrade Vish, we are still locating Comrade Jeremy Corbyn. As soon as he has joined, I think Comrade Vish will give him the opportunity to speak. But thank you very much to all our panelists with your contribution. Thank you so much. Over to you, Comrade Vish.
Yes, comrades. Comrade Corbyn has sent his apologies. He is going to join us. He's just caught up, but he's going to plug in shortly. In the meantime, we'll continue with our program. The next panel is on learning lessons from the HIV/AIDS struggle for a people's vaccine. I'd like to invite Comrade Mazibuko Jaha from South Africa. Mazibuko was the founding chairperson of the Treatment Action Campaign. Mazibuko, over to you.
Good afternoon, comrades. Thank you very much for hosting this important assembly. It's quite important that we take forward the struggle. This moment of crisis, like we learned in the struggle against AIDS, can be a moment where we mobilize the mass power of ordinary people to impact on both the state, on the pharmaceutical industry as well, but also importantly, on the world trade regime. These are the 3 important lessons which we want to bring forward from the struggle against HIV and AIDS in South Africa. Firstly, were to focus on the need to save lives. That was crucial. It is also crucial now in the struggle against COVID. We have seen the impact. That focus on lives is important. Many speakers have already explained how neoliberalism has impacted on how lives of ordinary people get poorer and poorer and weaker under neoliberalism. So we cannot forget that focus on lives. Secondly, the politics, the economics, and the science of HIV, of AIDS, of treatment, and also of access to treatment was very important for ordinary activists to understand how these things interconnect. I think the COVID-19 pandemic also calls for a similar approach where we go to the heart of the problem, the political economy, the science, and also then work out ways in which we can ensure that information, knowledge, expertise about those things gets demystified. It gets to the power of ordinary people. Importantly, also in the struggle against HIV/AIDS, what we emphasized in South Africa and even elsewhere in the world was the need to build mass power. It's not going to be the boardrooms, it's not going to be Zoom meetings, all of those are important, but as difficult as the COVID-19 moment is for organizing in the ordinary way, we have to think of new ways in which we can bring the mass power of ordinary people to bear on the state, to bear on the pharmaceutical industry, to bear on the World Trade regime, where these things are decided. So for me, those are the three crucial lessons which I think we can adapt and apply in our current moment. Without that, I think then we will be wasting our time, because ultimately these governments are not going to listen if we do not have a real mass voice on the ground. But that mass power on the ground has to be informed, has to be educated, has to organize, has to have a strategy. And I think various elements of that are beginning to emerge. But all of that strategy has to speak to the question of alternatives. In the struggle against HIV/AIDS, we're to begin to go beyond the state, where, for example, the National Strategic Plan, which now is official policy of government, had to emerge from grassroots platforms, in church halls, in community meetings, people speaking openly about what they wanted to see, and also acting out what they wanted to see by occupying hospitals, by occupying clinics, by occupying government offices, and even also going to occupy the offices of pharmaceutical companies in the big centers of Johannesburg, and even going to court to ensure that it's not just the mass occupation, but also it's accompanied by something with legal force. So I think those are some of the strategies which we have to adapt to our context right now. Without going too far, I'll keep it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Mazibuko. Our next speaker is Louise Chingandu from Frontline AIDS, and they also a partner in the Global People's Vaccine Campaign. Over to you, Louise.
Thank you very much. I want to talk about the reason why the People's Vaccine is very important for ending HIV. To start with, AIDS is not over, and therefore, even though our attention has been diverted by COVID, we should not forget that HIV is still a life-threatening disease. What we want to take from HIV, which is very important, is to learn from history and not allow history to repeat itself, particularly right in front of our eyes. When the COVID vaccine came on, we who lived through the HIV era immediately saw the similarities, the selfishness that took place during the HIV era, and allowed thousands and millions of people to die unnecessary deaths. Why? Because of these pharmaceuticals and all these complicated laws and policies that are just put there at the expense of human life. It's also important that we end COVID in order for us to protect the gains and the investments that we've put in HIV. And when I'm not talking about just financial investments, I'm talking about human investments. We have huge structures and systems from the top right up to the grassroots level that we designed to fight HIV. And we need to protect those structures because, as another speaker said earlier, they can easily be adapted and adopted to respond to COVID and to push the vaccines right up to the periphery where marginalized communities are found. We can also not allow COVID to continue to erode our economies, because we know the strong linkages that exist between HIV and poverty. And if we allow people to go into deeper poverty, it just means we are going to end up with a new emerging HIV huge crisis than what we have at the moment. And so it's very important for HIV movements and individual activists who were there in the battle of fighting for HIV treatment to come back to the front line, because you are needed right now for us to fight again for the vaccine, to get the vaccine to everybody as soon as we can, so that we can end COVID. We can also really learn from our previous experience. We know that inequalities really drive HIV. And what we are seeing with COVID is again an increase in inequalities. And this, unjust division and access and problems to just make sure that the vaccine is available universally is in itself creating new inequalities. And we know those inequalities will fuel HIV and they will also fuel COVID. 3 things we must take from HIV. One is the voice of the people. During HIV, it was the people who went into the street, who toyed, who spoke, who fought, and until we won. It was the people's anger that changed everything. And therefore, when we are talking about advocacy for vaccine, we need to get the people on board, and we need to hear their voices need to be heard. The second thing is that during HIV, we created a medicine patent pool for HIV drugs, and that's the reason why they ended up affordable. With COVID, WHO has created CTEP, and we can see the politics that is beginning to be at play to avoid CTEP being funded and to make sure that it becomes successful. Because we know if it's allowed to flourish, through it, we can actually make vaccines more widely available. The last thing is with HIV, we learned that strong community and health systems are critical. And yet our understanding of COVID is that it is actually decimating all those systems. The health systems are going, the community systems are going. So if we do not stop COVID, we are going to end up with very weak system. And then we have to start afresh for any other, beside HIV, for any other crisis, health crisis that we have. We need the systems to remain in place. So my last call is again to reinforce and call on HIV movements and activists. You have the experience, you know what to do, you remember at the HIV/AIDS conferences, we would destroy those pharmaceutical stands. That was our anger. We need to re-energize that anger again. Let's bring it back into this battle. This is a very similar battle, and there's no reason why we should shy away from it. We need to be at the forefront. Thank you.
Thank you, Louise. I'm going to hand over to Anne Marriott. She's the chief campaigner for health issues in Oxfam. She's also been integrally involved in the People's Vaccine campaigning work on a global scale. And she'll also give us an update on what's happening globally and share with us the call for a people's vaccine. Over to you, Anne.
Thank you so much for the opportunity, and what a privilege it is to share the platform with so many amazing speakers today. The situation we are in today, that of vaccine apartheid, was as predictable as it is totally unacceptable. In rich countries, 1 person is being vaccinated every second, yet the majority of developing countries have yet to see a single dose. And from the very outset of this pandemic, many, many of us were calling for conditions to be placed on the billions of public funding being spent on the research and development for these vaccines, shouting very loudly that there should be no blank checks. So many of us were saying that the science being funded by our taxes should be free of intellectual property barriers, global public goods. And why? Because we all knew that the world has not had to make vaccines for everybody on the planet all at once before. We all knew that the medicine system that we have consistently puts the profits of pharmaceutical corporations ahead of people's lives. And we all still rage with the injustice of inaccessible treatment for HIV, responsible for the needless loss of millions of lives. And so many people around the world continue to die today because the pockets of shareholders are always put first. And you know, we saw many world leaders lining up last April at a series of global summits to declare that any successful vaccine, if developed, would be a global public good. And 11 months on, so far they have completely failed to deliver that. And it was early recognition that blank checks were being written using our taxes, and that nothing but crumbs of charity were on the table to fix the inevitable shortages of vaccine and the inevitable vaccine inequality that we see today that led to the formation of the People's Vaccine Campaign, a campaign that was kicked off last May with a letter from over 140 leading public figures around the world, including former leaders such as Gordon Brown and Ellen Johnson-Sirleaf, and current leaders, including Imran Khan, Cyril Ramaphosa, and Macky Sall. And they were joined by many leading economists and thinkers, including Nobel laureate Joseph Stiglitz and Mariana Mazzucato. The call for a people's vaccine is summed up with 3 asks: that COVID-19 vaccines must be universally available, distributed equitably according to need and not ability to pay, and they should be free of charge for everybody on the planet. 2, that the vaccine science and know-how, the vaccine blueprints, should be openly shared, free of intellectual property barriers, so that qualified manufacturers around the world can join in the effort of producing them. And thirdly, that we need a global vaccine manufacturing and distribution plan for cost price, not profit price vaccines, with needed investment in production capacity and health workers. And in this, we are calling for priority attention to manufacturing and health workers in developing countries. Unfortunately, these asks remain as relevant and urgently needed today as they did last May. And today we have a situation where, on average, as many people have said, rich countries have enough to vaccinate their entire populations 3 times over. And in the majority of developing countries, 9 in 10 people are set to miss out on a vaccine this year. And today we have 2 concrete mechanisms on the table to help us get to a people's vaccine. But as we've heard again, a handful of pharmaceutical corporations and a small number of rich countries are standing in their way. The first, as many have commented, is a proposal backed by over 100 countries at the World Trade Organization to temporarily suspend the intellectual property rights of pharmaceutical corporations. We know that rich countries continue to block that proposal, but the struggle is not over. It has been kicked into the long grass by those rich countries just last week at the last TRIPS Council meeting, but the discussions will continue. There are more meetings in April and another formal meeting in June, and we have to build our fight to confront that opposition at those moments. The second is a mechanism at the World Health Organization that Lois was talking about called CTAP. This is a pool set up for sharing COVID-related IP, technology, and know-how to transfer the recipes for these vaccines, as well as tests and treatments, to other qualified manufacturers. And so far, not one pharmaceutical corporation has come forward to join the pool. As rich country leaders and the pharmaceutical industry continue to block these solutions and attempt to distract the world with inadequate charitable solutions, our People's Vaccine Campaign has grown and grown, and momentum really is on our side. The Vaccine Alliance, the People's Vaccine Alliance, is now well over 50 organizations from all over the world, including UNAIDS, Amnesty International, Public Citizen, Oxfam, the Fight Inequality Alliance, Section 27, Frontline AIDS, Public Services International, many of you who are here today. We are leading figures in public life, including the Archbishop of Cape Town, Graça Machel, Moussa Faki, Bernie Sanders, Mohammed Yunus, Chelsea Clinton, and Rebecca Greenspan, to name just a few. And we are truly working to influence parliaments and governments everywhere, and especially those who house the pharmaceutical corporations who are unwilling to share. We have engaged journalists with eye-watering statistics and stories, and they are starting to do our work for us, asking the power holders the difficult questions, holding them to account, doing their own investigations into the injustices perpetrated by the pharmaceutical industry. And we are targeting pharmaceutical corporations themselves, pressuring them to put people before profits at every turn. And just this week, on the anniversary of the declaration of the pandemic, we held our second People's Vaccine Day of Action, with public demonstrations outside pharma headquarters in South Africa and Switzerland, in the UK and the US, with press conferences and press work in at least 30 countries. The People's Vaccine was trending on social media for much of the day, and we hosted 2 amazing global rallies where we heard from leading public figures alongside patients and health workers on the front lines, and where Bernie Sanders formally endorsed our campaign. And we do know that the pressure is being felt. It's working. People can see that the charitable fixes are not fixing the problem. Pharmaceutical corporations are having to resort to public letters to President Biden, pleading with him to stand his ground on intellectual property, a sign that they're worried their heavily financed inside lobbying track is not working so well. Leaders are showing signs of wobble as the stark inequalities are impossible to hide, and supplies, even in rich countries, have been hit by delays because of our united high dependence on a handful of pharmaceutical corporations. But we're nowhere near naive. We know the struggle for affordable HIV treatment took a decade and still continues on many fronts. We know that the vested interests are huge and will obstruct change at every turn. But we also know it's a fight we have to win, and as quickly as possible. And it's a fight that can truly unite us across the world, because it is actually true that no one is safe until we all are. We are joined in a common interest to end this pandemic. And this fact brings huge opportunity for solidarity and for victory. And I hope not just a victory for COVID-19 vaccines, but a victory that shifts the landscape possible for a future medicines model that better serves the right to health for all of us. And now really is the time to win this. I feel the next few months are absolutely critical for this struggle. And it's people power, as others have said, organized people power that will make the difference. And for the next few months presents plenty of opportunities for us to come together. Global health summits, World Health Assemblies, the G7 and the G20. But as so many people have already said, at the local level, in the national spaces, we also need to make those voices heard. Take advantage of opportunities to name and shame those blocking the way for fairer universal access. So I'll finish by asking you all, if you haven't already, to join the People's Vaccine Alliance and campaign. As an individual, you can visit peoplesvaccine.org to see what action you can take as an individual, but also join us as an organization or individual. You can go to our website to contact us if you want to find out more and more about what can be done. But the People's Vaccine belongs to everyone, and we are thrilled that People's Vaccine campaigns are springing up in different countries, including in South Africa and in Kenya. And we encourage all organizations and individuals to do that as well. We need the campaign everywhere because we need the vaccine everywhere. Thank you so much for the opportunity.
Thank you. That was excellent. So comrades, here's the rallying call for us all to kind of champion the People's Vaccine Campaign in our national spaces globally, and to bring the social weight and strength that all our organizations and movements have. I'm now going to kind of open it up to have more engagement around the inputs that have come through. Some of you have placed some comments and questions in the chat group, so maybe we can engage with some of that first. Gideon Duplessis asks about what is your view on mandatory vaccination at the workplace versus an awareness campaign to persuade the anti-vaxxers to change their stance? Does anybody want to take that question? Gideon is a leader also of another trade union movement, but he's here in his individual capacity today. Anyone from the trade unions on our panel want to respond to that? The whole question of rights of workers in workplaces. Nobody? Okay.
I wish, if I may.
Yeah, sure, Keith, go for it. Yeah, go for it.
Yeah. No, thanks. What we are saying is that vaccines should be the right of workers to be vaccinated, and a healthy workplace is paramount. And therefore, whilst we are also educating those that are against being vaccinated for whatever reason, we are saying that all these vaccines should be made available to workers, and that is part of the occupational health and safety of workers. And whilst we will continue to have vaccines, we will continue to also fight for the provision of all the other protocols like your masks and sanitizers at the workplace. Thanks.
I mean, just to say, comrades, that I'll bring in Aslam now. Comrade Jeremy will be joining us shortly. So let's just continue engaging, and we'll bring him in at the right time. Also, please fill in the register that's going around, because we want to stay in touch and build solidarities. Aslam, over to you.
Thank you very much, Vish. Look, this is a very important question, and it comes up all the time. I think it's important to set in place a couple of principles. One being that vaccination is a voluntary act. In the South African Constitution, the right to bodily integrity is pretty clear, and anyone who refuses a vaccine has a right to do so. Now, in a workplace where some are vaccinated and others refuse to be, it may be that this situation just is allowed to persist. If it does have a public health dimension, certainly something can be done, but I very much doubt that vaccination can be made compulsory, nor should it, given the fact that it doesn't give 100% protection anyway. But the most important thing is to develop a clear-cut communication strategy to avoid vaccine hesitancy. Because often we find that vaccine hesitancy is not rooted in some conspiracy theory. It's actually the fault of those who promote vaccines to communicate clearly, a failure to communicate clearly. And this becomes a problem. So perhaps we need to look at how we communicate better. But to make it compulsory, I think, is a non-starter. Thank you.
Thanks, Aslam. Comrade Jeremy Coburn has joined us, but we're going to let the plenary unfold and more engagements and questions, and then we'll bring him in shortly. So Sunny Morgan asks, what is the most concrete steps that South Africans can take to push for free access for everyone everywhere? We have seen that protests outside HQ of Big Pharma, Pfizer even refused to come and accept the memorandum. So this is a question to I suppose all of us. I mean, not just South Africans. I mean, what can we do in our national spaces? We have amazing movements and organizations and trade unions in this conversation. So how can we bring our social weight to bear, comrades, in our national spaces to advance a people's vaccine call and agenda? Any thoughts from you, please? So we've been seeing campaigning outside Big Pharma headquarters. Is there something more that we need to be doing? We've got dates for the next sittings of the World Trade Organization in April and June from Anne's input. The EU Commission is sitting at some point. The UN will be sitting in September, etc. But what else can be done in national spaces? I think that's the first question I'd like to throw out to the plenary and to hear from yourselves. We have comrades from Los Angeles, from the Strategy Center of Social Movements. Maybe you want to also share some thoughts on this. There was also a point made by a comrade from La Via Campesina that maybe it's also time to push to get the WTO out of pharmaceuticals. La Via has been championing for almost 2.5 decades the call for the WTO to be pushed out of agriculture. So maybe some thoughts on that, Anne and others in the People's Vaccine Campaign. It'd be good to hear from you. The floor is open, comrades. So how do I speak? Eric Mann in Los Angeles. Jane, can you assist to bring Eric in to share some thoughts from the US context? Jane, are you there?
If I may.
Okay.
Yeah, hi.
Who's that? Is that Eric?
Yes, can people hear me?
Yeah, okay, go for it, and then I'll bring in Comrade Zweli. Go for it, Eric.
Thank you, comrades. Just very briefly, Eric Mann with the Labor Community Strategy Center in Los Angeles. Just yesterday, we had a wonderful block party, and we work in the Black and Latino community in South Central, East LA, and nationally, we've been part of the international climate justice movement. We've been looking for an Africa campaign. We had about 40 leaders from the community, and the main thing we're trying to say is we're looking for points of access. This is a phenomenal breakthrough for us around the WTO, around Big Pharma. We're also going to do some thinking, like for instance, we're thinking about going to CVS drugstores and the different drugstores. My mind is already thinking about, mass organizing to build a base among of consciousness around this. So the main point I'm saying is I'm here as a learner today. I'll be back with some really good ideas soon. The main point is I'm deeply moved by this, and we're on the case. And for those of you who know us, we'll be a significant force in this terrific movement you're building, and just great appreciation to be part of it.
Thank you, Eric. I'm just going to bring in Comrade Zweli and Comrade Baba, and then I'll take Elelu. Comrade Zweli, over to you.
Look, officials, we usually make a slogan that says power concedes nothing without a struggle. In the context of South Africa, we did that People's Coalition on Vaccine, People's Coalition on the Coronavirus, the various working class formations that SAFTU is working with, for example, to coalesce more, to be more consistent, to put the pharmaceutical companies here at home under more and increasing pressure, to put more pressure on the South African government, but more importantly, to mobilize at the regional and at the continental level. It is ironic that in the past we succeeded to force the big pharmaceutical companies to let go of their intellectual property rights when we're fighting against the crisis of HIV and AIDS in South Africa. They waived. This week they refused, mainly because, in my view, only 2 countries, being South Africa and India, were more consistent and making the biggest noise in the WTO for the pharmaceutical companies to waive. They refused. And the best way to address that will be if we mobilize working class formations across the globe, not just in the African continent, to begin to scale up the pressure on the local government to speak up at the level of the World Trade Organizations, to demand that waiver and to demand more transparency and to make sure that the big industrialized world come to the party in relation to putting their own farmers or their own country-based pharmaceutical companies to agree to the waiver. Otherwise, they will continue, and we will continue to mouth this that they are now becoming even more rich when millions of our people are facing death all over the world.
Excellent. Thank you, Comrade Vavi. So there's some great hands coming up. So Baba, you in the queue, then Esther, Anna, and Carlos. And I've noted somebody from the attendees. Go for it, Baba.
Right. Yeah, thanks, Vishwas. Well, this international struggle, I mean, with the days, WTO, G20, they are important because they help to put there in the faces of working class people across the world concretely the importance of, the international nature of capitalism. So they present an opportunity for deepening, class internationalism. However, at the same time, concurrently, I mean, politics, in a sense, as some say, is local. It's there's a palpability, where people can touch and fight against the bosses on the ground. The primary enemy is always at home, in a sense. So in this light, I think it is important for working class organizations, trade unions, to mobilize, build strength with civil society organizations, community-based organizations, to put pressures on governments, to enact necessary measures. Mazibuko pointed in that direction. And when we look at it, I spoke earlier of, the post-World War II order, what Ken Loach described as, the spirit of 45. These were not given out of benevolence. These arose from mass of, sit-in strikes in the United States, hunger marches in Britain, and, national liberation movement on the ground. So we need to build our power from below. And in seeing how the international and the national are linked, a number, it's not just about the waiver and all that. You have had several infection prevention and control measures, recommendations by the World Health Organization, ILO recommendations on workplace safety and all that. All these emerge more often than not from negotiations with countries, and in which the poorer countries are more influential. They should not be ceilings. They should be floors. We should fight in our countries to expand them. Two quick examples. One, the WHO recommends at least 1 meter physical distancing. There are countries where you have had 1.5, 2, so we should be, and it's important for our campaigns for us to also have arguments, evidence-based. There is much more than enough evidence to tap into, and this also brings to bear the need for establishing or strengthening linkages with radical research and educational institutions of the people. So these are what how we should fight, contribute to the fighting at the local. And just to sum up, when we talk of the local or the less international, we should also see the interfacing place of the regional. I think that trade unions, civil society organizations in Africa, for example, must take up that, okay, it will be 20 years of the Abuja Declaration by April. You've all gone to sleep. This has contributed to the lack of crisis preparedness. The public health system on the continent is in shambles. This must stop, and we should use this and every plank we can to fight for systemic change in health and in society to build a better world. Thank you.
Thank you. Esther, over to you. Esther? Esther? Can you hear me, Esther?
Hello, yes. Yes.
Go ahead. Go ahead.
Yeah. A lot has been said, and I just want a few recommendations. One of the recommendations is our government should put systems together to ensure that our medical system is being built. For instance, in my country, Sierra Leone, even before the pandemic, we flew out of Sierra Leone to abroad, to other places for minor sicknesses. Our government officials, they don't attend medical facility here, which means the medical facility here is underdeveloped. So our presidents, our leaders need to step up with all the different documents they sign up to, in terms of improving the health system. We are not seeing anything. So we, as civil society, we want to see government should step up. Government should invest more in the health sector of the country, so that the masses can be saved, because not everybody has the resources to go out of Senegal for medical treatment.
Thank you, Esther. I'm going to take 3 more inputs, and then I'm going to hand over to Comrade Jeremy to give us his contribution. Anna?
Thank you. I guess I just wanted to remind everyone what Lois was saying about using our collective anger in the right spaces, and to channel that anger in different ways. So I think, one thing, I know there's a lot of representation from South Africa on the call today. One thing I really feel that the South African government is doing well is its representation at the World Trade Organization right now. And while there is much justifiable anger about how the government is behaving in different spaces, in that space, it is representing very well. And I think it needs to hear from people that that representation is welcome, and that they should push forward with the agenda that they're leading on right now and not wave from it. I think that there are some developments that may dilute some of the appetite from both the Indian government and the South African government to keep pushing forward on this agenda. And I think it needs to hear from people that it must stand the course on that. In other ways, I think, we know that a lot of the power for the decision making, or for the blockers for the TRIPS waiver, but also those who have the power and influence on pharmaceutical corporations, are unfortunately governments in rich countries. And we are seeing in many spaces that parliamentarians are raising their voices. And while the governments themselves may not be supporting the TRIPS waiver, an increasing number of parliamentarians are. And I think it's incredibly important for us to join up and raise the voice of people from developing countries, have exchanges between those people and the parliamentarians to gain momentum in the critical capitals in the UK, in the US, and in the European Parliament as well. I absolutely think that we need to continue directing anger at the pharmaceutical corporations, and South Africa particularly has such an important role to play in that from the history of the HIV struggle. I do think pharmaceutical corporations remain in fear of a repeat kind of struggle in the same way that we had during the HIV crisis, or the struggle rather for HIV treatment. I think we need to replicate that, as Lois said. And finally, I really feel it's important for us to identify manufacturers, pharmaceutical manufacturers from developing countries, and talk to them, encourage them to raise their voice across the African continent, particularly, to come forward and say, look, we have the capacity to make these vaccines. We have the ability, if you transfer the technology and the know-how, if you remove those intellectual property barriers, we can help and produce enough vaccines for our people. We desperately need those local manufacturers to raise their voice in public spaces, in global spaces, and say, we're here, we need the resources, we need the investment, and we need the science and the know-how, but we can help end this pandemic if you remove those barriers. I think that's such an incredibly important role. Thank you.
Thank you. It's a great contribution. Carlos, and then Adrian, and then we're going to hand over to Comrade Jeremy Coben. Carlos?
Thank you. I don't know how to get the hand arrow. Okay. It's obvious and it's very clear for all of us that there's no way that we can suggest a mandatory vaccination of everybody. Will not work. Although in history, we can remember, for example, the temporary work program that existed between Mexico and United States back in 1942 and 1964. 5 million Mexicans, peasant Mexicans, were brought to United States to work on their temporary work program that is well known as the Bracero program. All the braceros who came to United States were vaccinated against smallpox, according to regulations by the Department of Health in the United States. So that's a part of history, very important. What is important, I guess, is that to understand that individual well-being is not the priority. The priority is the collective well-being of our communities, of our peoples. So we need to convince all those who don't understand, the hope that the vaccination has created in all the people that have been deeply affected by this economic crisis, that the collectivity and the common good, common well-being is more important than anything. So we have to do two very important fights. We have to fight against the lack of information, because there's not enough information coming to the people in the bottom about what is the meaning of this vaccination process. The other part is also, we need to fight against the misinformation. In the North, United States, Canada, and Europe, is not only the right-wing sector of our society, speaking against the vaccination. It's also the left who is speaking against vaccination. Why? Because they have all the vaccines under their control, because they have health systems, public systems that were the result of working people's struggles. So we have to make sure that the people that are affected, deeply affected by this crisis, have the right to take the vaccine as a voluntary gesture once they are informed about the implications of the vaccination. Again, I like to reiterate something that I say. Working people have the power by disrupting the economic sectors that are essential for capital to make sure that the vaccine is available to everybody all over the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Carlos. Adrian Bamboo, you had your hand up for a while, so can you intervene quickly? Jane, can we give the platform to Adrian? Yes, Adrian, please.
Yes, I'm here. Good afternoon to you and morning to us here in Los Angeles, California. My name is Adrienne Bambou Diagne. I'm from Senegal, West Africa, and I'm a midwife, reproductive health advisor, specialized on HIV/AIDS, and I work for Doctors Without Borders, Médecins Sans Frontières, in different countries, including in, well, I can say South Sudan, Burundi, Rwanda, Tanzania. Hola, Carlos, yo trabajé también in Nicaragua and Honduras. There is somebody there speaking Spanish close to us. And I'm based in Los Angeles again. And I direct an HIV/AIDS clinic some years ago in Madagascar. I want to talk briefly about Senegal, the experience we have on HIV/AIDS. You all know that our prevalence is 0.5% of HIV in HIV/AIDS. And right now we are the #2 leading the fight against COVID, because we have great results in Senegal, and we applied a strategy that is based on information, education, and communication. Here in Los Angeles, I'm working on the COVID initiative with the Department of Public Health. And I was invited yesterday by our brother and sister in Los Angeles to join the group. And it was wonderful. My situation here, why I'm talking today, is because I saw that the situation that we have in Africa today is the same than what we have before with the HIV/AIDS. A group of people, a nation, have the vaccine, or have the medicine, the antiretrovirus, and we Doctors Without Borders were fighting to have it at a certain cost. very low for people to get the antiretroviral. Same thing with the COVID. A group of population, and most of the time is about the systemic racism and the corporation holding the vaccine when other people are struggling to get access to it. We could get 250,000 doses in Senegal, but we are 16 million people. What can we do is like a drop of water, a drop in the ocean, a drop of water in the ocean. Now, what strategy can we use? I will be pleased to help and assist you guys, assist the team to work on a certain strategy that has a positive effect here in Los Angeles, California. And as I work for the outreach and engagement team on the COVID initiative here, but also we have a rollout on the vaccine, and we can have access to the vaccine at the free cost. Meaning, how can we do in Africa until we have a common group of how can I say, responders, emergency responders will be set all over the Africa, and that we manufacture the vaccine also in Africa, that we inform people, work on information, education, and communication with the population, and debunking the issue on COVID and the issue on the vaccine, because there is a lot of fake information. I think it's like a rewiring or rebooting our computer. That is our brain. Meaning the coalition is amazing. I'm really so happy to see you here. And I will jump on board as soon as you want. You guys will be ready to work, on the certain way. Thank you.
Thank you, Adrian, and other comrades on this platform. Please fill in your details into the register. I'm now going to hand over to Comrade Jeremy Coben. Jeremy, over to you for your input.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to come on this call this afternoon. I've been listening to the discussion for the last 20 minutes, half hour or so, and I have to say I agree with pretty well everything that's been said. From me, first of all, in London this weekend, there's a huge amount of tension around because of the killing of a young woman on the streets earlier this week by an off-duty police officer, it seems. He's been charged with the offence but not prosecuted yet, and that has led to massive demonstrations and a huge issue of police activity last night on Clapham Common in South London. And so there is huge tension around, but if you want to get a good summary of the situation, I advise you to look on the Unite the Union website. They've made a very, very good statement about it yesterday evening. The issue of the COVID crisis is something that is actually very profound, and I'm really pleased that we've got global unions making statements about this and working on this, because this is a time when we have to recognize what has happened, recognize the dangers of corona, but also recognize that under the radar of corona there's been a massive transfer of power and wealth around the world away from working class communities in favor of big business and big pharma, and we cannot ignore that. The inequalities that have been exposed by the COVID crisis are huge. The poorest people in the poorest countries have suffered the most. The poorest people in the relatively wealthy European and North American countries have also suffered the most. There's been a wholly disproportionate death rate amongst Black and minority ethnic communities, particularly those in this country, in the UK, that work in the health and social care sector. And the government's response has been unbelievably inadequate. The World Health Organization declared the pandemic more than a year ago. The British government was at that time still grandly talking about herd immunity and issues like that. And when they did bring in a track and trace system, they spent over £30 billion on a track and trace system. The
have all gone to the private sector, and it's been spectacularly ineffective. And they're now proposing to not just not raise the wages of those working in the health and social care sector, but actually give them in real terms a cut in their pay as a response to the huge amount of work that they've done. So those inequalities that exist in this country also exist all over the world and are becoming more and more apparent as the days go on. The work done by scientists and researchers in many countries in order to develop a vaccine is amazing, and it shows what can be done when there is enough money put into doing it and there's enough determination to achieve it. But the issue has to be that the vaccines that have been developed, the patents of which are owned by individual companies for the most part, the biggest farmers, Pfizer, AstraZeneca, and so on, own the patents to it. And we're in for another round of the patent war. Now, sisters and brothers that are on this call from South Africa will be very well aware of the heroic role that all of you played in forcing Big Pharma to reduce the prices of antiretrovirals in South Africa and develop generic medicines in exactly the same way that sisters and brothers in India did the same. During my time as leader of the Labour Party in Britain, we developed a policy where we would have a publicly owned pharmaceutical company that would manufacture generic medicines at cost price, not for profit company, at cost price, to be sold to our National Health Service and obviously exported on the same principles around the world. The UK Conservative government has a very, very different approach to this. So we have a situation where the World Health Organization have warned for years that health inequalities will hit everybody eventually. Ebola, obviously dangerous, obviously could spread a great deal unless dealt with. COVID spread very rapidly all around the world. Those countries that had an efficient track and trace system and an efficient response to it, such as New Zealand, South Korea, have actually come out of it much quicker than other countries that had a less effective one. So the response we should be making is to actually encourage the World Health Organization and support it in its demand that instead of private medicine around the world, we have the principle of public access to publicly owned, publicly run health services all around the world. Colleagues have just been pointing out the issue of rigged trade and the role of the World Trade Organization in this, and I too pay tribute to South Africa for adopting a different role at the World Trade Organization to all the others. But this body ought to be working on behalf of the people in this planet who need access to healthcare and medicines, rather than protecting the very biggest businesses and empowering them still further, as they're doing at the present time. So the lessons are huge and very profound. But there are also lessons about the quality of people's lives around the world and the environmental damage that we're all doing. This cannot be looked at in isolation. The corona crisis is a novel virus that has developed. More novel viri will develop. We're not moving into an era when there'll be no new health challenges. They're likely to get more intense, more profound, and worse. And so surely the principles have to be universal access to healthcare by public authorities, and not allow the World Trade Organization to protect and empower the biggest pharmaceutical corporations in the world in order to make a great deal of money out of whatever crisis is approaching. And so I would argue for generic price medicines being available to all countries in the world, particularly the poorest countries in the world. A couple of other things I just want to mention before I hand over to others. We established the Project for Peace and Justice in December. We announced its launch in January, so we haven't yet been going for 2 months. We've had 500,000 people join us on our initial call, and we've set up 4 areas of campaigning work stream. One is on media access and media control. And indeed, I'm doing a big call on this later on this evening at 6 o'clock at the same time, London time, which is about access to the media globally. Because if Big Pharma can control the world's medicines, then big business can also control the news values and access to news all around the world, with all the problems that go with that. So we're campaigning against Rupert Murdoch taking over yet more of British media, but we're also trying to empower those who are offering an alternative, and the many unions around the world that are also running their own channels. We need to bring all this together, because together we're much stronger than if we do it in isolation. We're also campaigning on COP26 to get a net zero by 2030, but also the technology transfers that go with it to ensure we get a green industrial revolution the world over, so that the environmental crisis is not used as an opportunity and excuse to make many people redundant in industries that currently are quite polluting, instead to convert those industries and protect the jobs at the same time. We only achieve that with strong and very large levels of trade union membership. We're also campaigning on economic inequalities in Britain, developing community organising and community fight back in favour of union recognition and protection, because the British Tory government is heading into another period of cuts in public spending, reduction in public sector wages, and at the same time, a tax system that actually benefits the very richest within our society. And that was the big attack that was made on us a year and a bit ago in the election, that we were, yes, proposing to spend a lot of public money. Absolutely, we were, on investment in job security for the future, not allow the present levels of inequality to go on. And the last area is one of international solidarity. We live on one planet. This planet has been disfigured by war. There are more people who are now refugees than any time in recorded history. They're the product of war, inequality, environmental injustice, and many other things. And so it is opposing the racists that would set the agenda against the refugees. That's why Black Lives Matter movement has been so important, not just for the Black community in the United States, for all that they've been through, but for all around the world, to better understand the collective history that our young people need to inherit for the future. So in summary, COVID has exposed what this world is like. COVID has exposed the power of Big Pharma. COVID has exposed the dangers to the poorest and most vulnerable people around the world. So in our solidarity, let's demand free access to medicine around the world. Let's demand those patents be given over to the World Health Organization rather than held by Big Pharma, many of whom only developed the new vaccines with public investment and public support to those companies. And don't allow the COVID crisis to be an opportunity to not furlough people, to not protect jobs and so on. Because if governments say you cannot congregate, you cannot work in a closed environment because of the danger of spreading COVID, they're taking a big responsibility onto themselves to sustain those people during that crisis. There's already been a massive transfer of wealth in this country between the poorest and the richest during the COVID crisis, and I suspect it's been far worse elsewhere. But we have each other, we have our strength, we have our solidarity, we have our principles, and above all, we have our strength of union membership around the world. Global union membership and global union action, like the Indian farmers have taken, is something that can bring changes and results, and above all, inspire and give hope to the next generation. Thank you very much for inviting me onto the call today.
Thank you so much, Comrade Jeremy. Very inspiring words, and your Peace and Justice project is definitely a rallying point for the renewal of internationalism, and I think we all are with you on that. I'm going to start wrapping up our assembly. We've come to the end. I'll just make one or two quick concluding points and hand over to Professor Michelle Williams, Chairperson of the Global University Program at Wits University. I think in our conversation today, comrades, we all recognize that we are facing multiple pandemics: the pandemic of inequality, the pandemic of climate crisis, and the pandemic of biology. And all of these things are coming together. And I think the argument was made here today that we need new institutions to serve humanity and non-human nature. And I think in this context, we need a new architecture. We need to go beyond the WTOs that are holding us back and affirming the power of capital and big corporations. And maybe today we should all grapple with this issue of pushing the WTO even out of pharmaceuticals and other areas of life that are so important for all of us. I think the second important point that was made here today was reiterating the case for a people's vaccine, against profiteering from this vaccine, against the racism that's come to the fore in the way it's being procured and hoarded. But at the same time, the HIV/AIDS struggle in South Africa has underlined the importance of really taking people's power into this fight. To achieve a people's vaccine, it has to be driven from below. We need the social weight of all the forces that are conglomerating here and beyond. We need the 200 million members of La Via Campesina. We need the millions of members of the trade union movement. We need the thousands of activists in the food sovereignty alliances across the planet to really push this further. And I think this is a very, very important lesson coming out of today's conversation. We want a public good. We want the vaccine to be part of a commons. I think the third important point that has come out is that healthcare has been about inequality. It's been inaccessible to the vast majority even before COVID-19. Decades of neoliberalization has even hollowed out and made our healthcare systems exclusive for a minority. And I think today we reaffirm the importance of the struggle for placing universal public healthcare on the national agenda. We've got to come out of this COVID moment clinching this. It's going to be important for further mutations, for further pandemics, and even for the climate crisis. So it's crucial for a progressive agenda today on the planet. The other very important point that was made was that we are all standing against vaccine deniers, vaccine anti-vaxxers, etc., that stand against the science around vaccines. And we have it on our continent, we have it here in South Africa and other parts of the world. We also here today affirm the importance of continuing the struggle wherever we are. So there are going to be key moments over the next few months with the WTO convening. There's going to be the UN meeting, there's going to be EU Commission sitting, etc., etc. We all need to rally as the calls come through. Different organizations in the space and beyond should step up, and we're all going to rally and build solidarity and push back. The outcomes from this, the recordings from all of this will be shared with the EU, the WTO, the US, and a whole host of other governments in the world. The other point that came out very strongly is that South-South countries should also step up. And we should, in our different countries, push them to also change the narrative. The idea that we have manufacturing capacity in our countries is very, very important. This point was underlined by Anna particularly. We need to reach out to manufacturers in our country and to get them to give voice to their role that they can play. And then finally, I think there were other campaign thrusts that people have spoken to. We really need to educate communities and workers around the information regarding vaccines and its importance, but we also need to educate against disinformation. We also had some very important other contributions. There is going to be a public transport campaign led by ITF. So I think all of us should be aware of this and rally to this and make the connections between public transport and vaccines as a public good and so on. With that, I'm going to hand over to Michelle Williams, the chairperson of the Global Labour University program at WITS, to say a vote of thanks.
Thanks, Vish. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So I wanted to start by thanking all of the panelists, and especially the trade union panelists, as well as the progressive civil society panelists. These are representatives from South Africa, the continent, and internationally. I want to thank everyone for coming. Because I'm the chairperson of the Global Labour University program at WITS, I want to give a special thanks to the trade union activists and leaders who came on board. I think it reflects the depth of our relationship between progressive academics and educationalists, as well as unionists. So thank you very much for your attendance today and your speaking. Secondly, I want to thank the attendees, both on Zoom, but even more on COPAC's Facebook page. There were many, many attendees on the Facebook page. I also want to thank the FES, the Friedrich Ebert Stiftung's Trade Union Competency Center. It's the Southern Africa region based here in South Africa. They help fund the backroom work that had to go into this today. So thank you, FES TUCC. I also want to thank, perhaps most importantly as well, is COPAC, and especially Jane Cherry, Awanda Buthelezi, and Ferial Adams for their behind the scenes work to make today happen, as well as to making the actual event. And then Vish, also, I would like to thank Vish Satkar, he's a member of the GLUE committee, but also a COPAC chairperson. So he brought these two things together to really do the background work to make this happen. I guess most importantly, I'd like to thank all the healthcare, the frontline workers, and all the people who are putting their lives on the line to keep us alive. So thank you. And I hope that today marks the beginning of a global, not just for vaccines, but as we heard, transport and all the other progressive issues that we need global struggles for. So I hope this is the beginning of a real global movement. And thank you to everyone for coming, and good night, or good morning to those of you in LA. But good whatever, wherever you are on planet Earth. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you,
very
Comrade.
much.
Amanda. Bye-bye.